All right, hello. We are recording the Promoting Failure Voya STEM webinar, and I'm Cameron McKinley. I am a high school technology integration coach. I also teach programming in the high school, and I'm going to introduce the rest of our guests, or let them introduce themselves.
Okay. Hi, I'm Diana Calopi. I teach 8th grade algebra and pre-algebra and occasionally geometry at Whitewater Middle School, and I'm also the math specialist in the building.
Hi, my name is Joe Fothery. I'm an instructor of creativity and innovation at Effingham High School in Effingham, Illinois.
Okay, so this is our panel for today, and we're just going to start by asking, why is promoting failure important to STEM? And we've got this quote here that starts with how it's tied to innovation. That basically innovators need to fail because they start with hunches, and that's how they generate their knowledge from failure. So some classroom examples, either of you?
Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I kind of, guess, want to address the first piece about why is promoting failure important to STEM, and I would even extend out to life. It's very rare that you do anything that failure isn't a part of what you do and how you do. And what seems to have happened over time is that we've looked at failure as a horrible negative thing. And failure can be bad, but it's really bad if it becomes the stopping point for what you're doing. And so one of the reasons why I believe it's very important in my classroom is that the students understand it's part of the process. So we do a lot of visioneering and brainstorming and really helping them look at ideas that they want to promote and they want to develop. And so we look at the end result, and this is where they want to be. And then we backward design and say, okay, what are the resources you need? What are the training? What are the learning pieces you need? Where do you think failure is going to come along the way at? What is it going to look like? What is it going to sound like? What's it going to do to the project and your process? And because the kids start looking for it, it's just not a shock to them whenever it happens, but it's an expected piece. Now, they're not always happy about it, but once we started doing that in our classroom and we really acknowledged that failure isn't a part of life and that it needs to be explored, it's really transformed as to how my kids address it and handle it, and ultimately what their successes look like down the road.
Great. I think for me, are we gonna?
Oh, it's okay. Go ahead.
For me, I think it's just a mindset that I want my students to have starting from the beginning of the year. I think that having my students understand that it's okay for them to fail and actually kind of promoting opportunities for them to fail and move on and try again just creates a culture that supports better learning and better creativity.
And Diana, how do you do that? How do you create that culture where your kids maybe not embrace it, but they understand? I'm curious how you and Cameron do that.
I like to start at the very beginning of the year, just kind of as part of my classroom culture building, throwing some things at the kids that aren't necessarily directly tied to algebra or pre-algebra, so to speak. So, for example, at the beginning of this year, I had kids working in teams of 2 or 3 and gave them just a standard 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and some scissors. And I started by asking if they could cut a hole in their paper big enough for them to fit through. Had to be a continuous piece of paper with no fixtures, no tape, no staples, anything like that. And they spent a lot of time cutting paper and throwing things away and getting frustrated. And as soon as I had the group who came up and said, we did it, and of course they flipped the piece of paper over the skinniest kid in the room, I looked at them and said, great, now can you make one big enough for you and a friend? And we just kind of keep adding and adding until I get to the point where somebody figures out a way to cut the paper to get maybe 2 or 3 kids to be able to fit in, to the point where I say, can you do that so that our whole class can be in the middle of a piece of paper? And usually by the end of the hour, we at least get a hole big enough for multiple students. This year, my algebra class did find success by the end of the hour, and we had 23 of us in one piece of paper in a giant hole. So it gives kids opportunities to try things and mess up and throw things away and go back at it and figure out what did they do in their cutting that caused it not to work, and how do they redo it so that it's not the same thing over and over again. And what I find when I can throw things in there like that are kind of just on a fun basis at the beginning of the year, then when we get into algebra and things that are harder for them that they don't understand, they're more willing to take a chance and put up what they think is a solution for something without being so upset if it isn't. If we erase, it's not a big deal to them.
And see, I love that, because the fact is, success, to me, that's one of the things we ask our kids is, what do you think your project's going to look like in the end? And we have a visionary of that, and when they get done, we balance and we look, okay, this is what you thought it would look like, this is what it actually is, and rarely does it look like what they thought it would look like. And so what I love about what you're doing is you're helping students look for multiple perspectives, different avenues whenever failure comes their way. And to me, that's one of the real strong pieces of learning, is that kids have to be able to possess those skills to be successful. That's why it's so important in a STEM class, where you're looking at experimentation, doing a lot of lab work, and you're doing a lot of theory, and you're trying to help them bring that back to practice. So what does that look like in your space, Cam?
Well, I was just saying what you guys are both talking about sounds like productive failure, which is showing on this slide. You're letting them experience the frustration and failure, which allows them to come up with solutions they probably wouldn't have thought of. I think a lot of times in our classrooms, we don't give kids enough time to do this. We're just rushing them through material. I'm lucky in that I get to teach programming in one of my courses, and programming, there's a number of ways you could program. It doesn't have to be one way, but there are better ways, sometimes more productive ways. But allowing a student to try and fail and then look back, and I ask them to reflect on that. What did you try when you turned this in, and what happened, and what did you try to fix it? What kind of things went wrong? What did you try to do to fix it? And even if it's not right, they can turn it in with that reflection, so that I'm giving credit to them for the trying and for the persevering and for the trying to find answers. Now, eventually, yeah, we want them to get to an answer, but sometimes there aren't answers to things. And sometimes you may have to ask someone else, or get collaboration, or get people to put multiple heads together to figure out how to solve something. And I think it's important to see how other kids might solve an issue. And they start this even in kindergarten, in some of our classes where they do number talks, and they ask, them to defend, how did you get this answer? And it's just great to see the thought process that goes on. You're not teaching them that an answer that's wrong is okay. You're teaching them that, how did you get to that answer? And let's look at your thought process, and then let's figure out another way where it might have gone wrong, and how to get to the right answer in different ways.
And see, the only way I think this works is if you've created a culture where, if we could go back just a second,
okay,
is if we could create a culture to make sure that productive failure can actually take place in your classroom. I don't think that classrooms where you see this happen repeatedly, I don't think it happens by accident. I think the teachers have worked really, really hard to create a culture where students understand how to do this. If you look at Angela Duckworth's work, where she talks about grit and perseverance, why do kids either possess it or not? And in a lot of cases, it's because the teachers have made them feel comfortable that it's okay to fail in your classroom. So if you have kids that come in your classroom at the beginning of the year, they never raise their hand, they don't participate, a lot of it is because they come from cultures where they're going to be made fun of, they're embarrassed about things. And so I think as a classroom teacher, you've got to really work on that. It takes us about a month in my classroom where our kids finally feel comfortable enough to put themselves out there. Now, these are 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And so you got to start thinking about, and I would encourage our audience, do your kids feel comfortable to raise their hands? Are they always participating? How do they handle failure? And if they're not handling it well, what can you do maybe to restructure that culture in your classroom to make sure that they have, really positive outcomes in there?
I think that ties into this next slide, which was about the do-over, that this was some study that's showing that elementary school students were accepting of failure when they had a chance to modify and test it again, where it wasn't the end and they said, F, you're done. And that's kind of what you're saying, that culture of that it's okay to mess up and try again they have to feel that that's okay. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I am, and I'm sure somebody's out there saying, well, I don't have an infinite amount of time. Well, you're right. There does have to be an end to a project. And that doesn't always mean that a student is going to perform well on it. You can still embrace failure, and the grades are going to be what the grades are. But what you hope is over time, whether it's an A or it's a lower grade, you're hoping you're building persistence and grit in a child so that over time, academic excellence becomes the norm that they shoot for, because now they understand that they can do those things, and that just because they failed the first time doesn't mean they're a failure. And I think that's one of the things we talk a lot about in class, the difference between failing and failure, and how you should embrace that and take that on. So in my class, it's always about doing the do-over, and it's not one and done. Diana, how's it for you?
There's a lot of different ways I'll incorporate do-overs, but one of the things that I do that I think it is kind of a group do-over, so to speak, that we will take a problem that we're working on and create just an answer bank on the board. And we get to a point where all the kids are willing to go ahead and throw their answer up there. And we do that before anyone knows how anyone arrived at those answers, which to some degree gives them opportunities to take that chance and that risk. And then usually what happens during that time is once groups see other people's answers, they end up going back and kind of looking at their own work again and rethinking through their own thought process to see. So that's just one way that we kind of have opportunities for do-overs within the structure of the class day. But I also really encourage students, if you haven't learned it the first time or you haven't figured it out the first time, that that's okay. And the whole goal is for you to get to that point where you feel confident and comfortable, and that you'll look at things again. And so when it comes to things that are related to grades, my students have opportunities to redo daily work. They have opportunities to redo things on tests. But again, you do have to eventually say, here's a time limit. But I think it's important for them to have opportunities to learn. And when you give them opportunities to do things over, you're showing them that it's okay to have failure along the way in that process of learning, and that's pretty natural and that's going to happen to everybody.
That actually sounds like the same thing as the number talks. They throw their answers up there and then figure out later how.
Yeah.
So in thinking about all this, what is a call to action for teachers to be able to create a culture of this and have a classroom where kids are not afraid to fail forward?
Diana?
Oh boy.
And this goal for your class. I think, Diana, you said this and I typed it down. What is the goal for your class? Were you the one that said this earlier?
I think it was Joe that you were impressed with. For me, I guess the biggest thing for me is just having students that will continue to try and to feel confident within my classroom enough that failing is part of the learning, and that they're willing to continue to persist through things and to continue to try. One of the things that really struck me this year, I do a lot of question asking when students don't have success in finding an answer. I'll ask a lot of questions to get them thinking about what they did and what may have gone wrong. And I have said to them in the past that, my goal is that eventually you're asking yourself these questions, and that it's not me asking you these questions to get you going. And I felt a huge victory this year when one of my students told me that's what she does on test days, that she, when she gets stuck on a problem, she sits and thinks for a minute, what are all those questions that Mrs. Willoughby asks us all the time, and kind of talks herself through some of the problems and gets herself to think about it. And I think for me, my goal is for what I model for them to transfer to their own learning, so that they can carry that out of, she's going to take that skill out of my classroom. And to me, that's huge. She'll carry that with her into high school, and she doesn't need me for that anymore.
I like that. I think another important thing would be to let them see you fail or us fail. And so when I am giving feedback to a student, maybe I'm doing a screencast, recording myself going through their program, or I'm trying to show them how to do a program. If it messes up, I don't stop the recording. I just keep going and I say, oh, wow, I tried this and it was just a mess. And let me go back and see what's happening. They can hear my thought process. They can hear me trying to come up with other ideas of how to do it. And it may end with, hey guys, I'm going to have to go back and look at this some more and figure out how to do this or something like that. So they can see that maybe even if I'm the teacher, I may not have all the answers, or they can get an idea of how I process something that didn't work and try to get through it. So I think them seeing us fail and try to persevere is important.
And I think for me, it's all about the culture. I want creative thinkers in my class that are fearless and understand life is not always a final copy, but instead it's a series of rough drafts. And you have to continue to work to refine the process. That doesn't happen by accident. So we spend a lot of time building family in our classroom. Collaboration is absolutely huge. And we teach students how to talk to one another and look at problems and address things. You know, music is a big part of our class. What do we want the atmosphere to be like in there? We want a professional, collegial culture in there. And so we spend a lot of time talking to the kids. And I would really encourage our attendees who are online watching this to think about, what do you want the atmosphere to look like? And how often are your kids involved in the discussions of creating that culture and atmosphere? We do it very regularly in our class. And my co-teacher and I, we spend a lot of time talking about we're not perfect. Society changes, life changes. It's different groups of kids every year. And as they help us set the parameters for the culture, then they're much more willing to work in line to make sure that that classroom excels, because they've bought into it. They have skin in the game now. And so what I would encourage people to do is to spend time, or if you're not happy with where your class is at, and if you feel like your kids struggle with handling failure, I would really do some reflection and start thinking about what that culture looks like in your classroom, because I think it can have a dynamic shift on the impact it will have on your kids in the classroom. And part of that has to be your willingness to look at those things and to be okay with transforming things. And if you've been a teacher that's been, this way forever, one of the most exciting things could happen in your school next year is if you become the change agent and you're willing to look at yourself and to be able to do those things. This is my 31st year starting, and I can guarantee you next fall I will start over again and look, because it's a new generation of kids and I've got to be there to meet their needs, not mine.
So maybe, hopefully from this, those of you watching will try to find, there's plenty of resources out there. I know the Cult of Pedagogy podcast has a great podcast on failure as a gift. There's some TED Talks and TED Ed that have some good starting points. And hopefully these ideas you've heard today, or looking up other teacher ideas, maybe just take one small step to doing something different in your classroom that promotes this idea of kids not being afraid to fail. And that'll be the first step. Any closing comments, panel?
If you want your kids to soar, I think this is one of the most important things you can ever take on, is trying to figure out how to make this a part of the process in your classroom. I'd also encourage you to pick up a copy of Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. Outstanding piece of reading I think you'll like very much.
Diana, anything, final thoughts?
I think, failure is a part of life. It's going to happen in all arenas. And so if we can incorporate that as a piece to what's happening in our classroom and let students know it's okay and that life moves on despite the failures, that we're teaching them a skill that far exceeds any subject area specifically that we're going to talk to them about throughout the year.
Well, I thank both of you for joining me today, and hopefully we'll get some more feedback from those watching online and some great resources to share. Thanks. See you later.